Hello and welcome to episode 13 of the Follycast, the Rivers of London podcast. I'm Margaret in Sutton and joining me today are...
Richard in Fulham.
Jan in Worcester.
And Jennie in Muswell Hill.
Yes, we're back. Having completed all the novels, novellas and short stories in our original year-long mission, we took a break to read, heaven forbid, books that haven't been written by Ben Aranovich, and then we don't have to take notes for a podcast either. We're planning to be back in April 2022 to review the 9th Rivers of London novel, Amongst Our Weapons, once it's been released, but decided to fit in an extra podcast now. The reason for this is the graphic novel Monday, Monday.
Now, we've been in two minds about whether to cover the graphic novels in the podcast, but Monday, Monday made up our minds for two reasons. Whereas past graphic novels of Rivers of London have been set in the gaps between previous novels, a bit like the novellas, Monday, Monday is the first to be set after the most recent novel, in this case, False Value at the time of recording. So it actually progresses the timeline. It also features some surprising developments that will be relevant for the next novel. So along the way in the podcast, we'll have a wider discussion about the Rivers graphic novels themselves, how we feel about graphic novels per se, and we'll preview the next novel in the light of Monday, Monday. Hopefully all in about 40 minutes or so.
The podcast will contain spoilers for Monday, Monday. So if you're planning to read it, you may want to store this one away until you have. However, if you aren't planning to read it and want to find out what happens, or if you're just curious about the Rivers of London graphic novels and whether you think you might like them, then stay tuned. But before we dive back into the Rivers of London universe, what have we been reading during our sabbatical from the Folly? What would you recommend to our listeners to fill the gaps until Amongst Weapons drops in April? Right, so one book each. Let's start with Jan.
I've read lots of books I've enjoyed, but this one is called The Girl Behind the Wall by Mandy Robotham, that was given to me by a friend who thought I'd be interested in it because it's set in 1960s Berlin and it's about twins who are separated. One gets injured when the war goes up and has a long stay in hospital. And so her and her sister are divided by the wall. The sister in the West manages to find a gap and get through and sneaks to meet her sister. And then we find out about the lives of the twins and how eventually the sister in the East who's started a new life there, has to make up her mind whether she wants to stay in the East or return to the West. I thought it was quite an interesting concept and a bit different from just a factual story about the history of Berlin and the war going up. Quite light-hearted in many ways, not too heavy, because there was quite a lot of humour in it and the relationship between the girls.
Cool, we'll put links to all our recommendations in the show notes. Jennie, what are you recommending?
Well, I'm recommending... It's interesting for two reasons. First of all, I never read either of these authors before. It's The Dark Remains, William McIlvanney. He died a couple of years ago. He wrote the Laidlaw books about a detective in Glasgow, and this was his final Laidlaw book, and it was finished by the writer at the other end of Scotland, Ian Rankin, who writes Rebus in Edinburgh. And it's fascinating. And you can't see the join. That was kind of one of the things I was looking for. Where was the join? I missed Rivers of London. This is Rivers of Glasgow and Edinburgh. No magic, but lots of whiskey and lots of corruption and lots of really heavyweight crime. Rankin tends to set Rebus in kind of contemporary times. William McIlvanney set his Laidlaw in the 70s. So it's a very, very different kind of Glasgow. It's kind of legendary, corrupt and dark Glasgow. But these two are the Knights of Tartan Noir. And I really highly recommend either of them, and particularly starting with this combined effort.
Margaret, what have you been reading?
I have been reading the Ashes of London series by Andrew Taylor, and I'm currently just about to start book 4, The King's Evil. These are set in London just after the fire of London in 1666. And I really don't like historical novels as a whole, but these are actually really great. You get a real sense of what London might have been like after the fire, the sort of stench, the poverty, what life at court was like. And it's set around St Paul's and Whitehall. So it's very gritty and very earthy. Quite like the two main characters are both flawed, which is interesting. And like the Rivers of London, the city itself is integral to the book and almost features as sort of character for the book. There was also a toss-up between this and another book called Meltman by Anna Burns, which both Jan and I have read, but obviously we thought probably that each of us would recommend it, so we haven't, so that's quite good too.
Yeah, loved Meltman, loved it.
Yeah.
We'll add a link to that as well.
Well, I bought it, but I haven't read it yet. It's still sitting, glaring at me, waiting for me to pick it up.
It's one of those books that once you get going is utterly brilliant, but you've got to get going.
Well, the one I'm going to recommend is Mr. Wilder and Me by Jonathan Coe, which was a hit with me because Jonathan Coe is one of my favourite authors, but also Billy Wilder is one of my favourite film directors. And it's one of those, in the modern day, a film composer thinks back to her big break that she had working in movies on Billy Wilder's last main film, which was called Fedora, shot in Greece in 1978. So it's very much a love letter. So many reviews now say, oh, it's a love letter too. But it is a love letter to the films of Billy Wilder, but also has got quite a dark side as you understand more about Billy Wilder's escaping Germany in the 1930s and what happened to his family who didn't escape. I really loved it. So there have been 8 graphic novels so far, and they've all been set in the gaps between the novels up to now. And Monday came out in November 2021, and that's what we're mainly going to talk about. It's co-written by Andrew Cartmel, who in many ways is Ben Ivanovich's consigliere, with art by Jose Maria Baroy, and it's split into 4 separate chapters, as we see the same Monday play out from the perspective of 4 of our characters. All 4 chapters are woven around the story of a Swedish werewolf in London. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, then here's a quick synopsis.
In the first chapter, D.I. Stephanopoulos leads a team investigating a series of street robberies around King's Cross and calls in Peter Grant when investigations lead to a sighting of what seems to be a werewolf. Stephanopoulos successfully uncovers a member of her team who is feeding information to the criminals. We spend chapter 2 with Nightingale, who reminisces about school days with his fellow practitioner David Mellenby, and we also encounter their meeting with a werewolf in Prague in 1939. He eventually finds some inner peace by babysitting twins he refers to as Taiwo and Kehinde.
So who are Taiwo and Kehinde? Well, they are Peter and Beverly's twins, and in chapter 3 we meet the new arrivals and their Fox security detail as we see Peter's own version of that Monday. His investigations of the werewolf are brought to a shuddering halt by his father's heart attack. His dad survives, but things may never be quite the same again. Finally, we switch to Foxglove at the Folly, who, along with Abigail, ends up chasing but eventually befriending Oscar, a young Swede who can transform into the werewolf of D.I. Stephanopoulos' original investigation. They help him repatriate back to Sweden. So it's a surprising book in that we get to meet Peter and Beverly's kids ahead of them actually being born in the book series. We also know that Peter's dad will have a coronary at some point. However, the back cover blurb for the upcoming Amongst Our Weapons says that the twins have yet to be born. As one of our listeners, Sariana, pointed out to us, it's now clear that Monday is not just set after False Value, it's actually set after Amongst Our Weapons and potentially other books as well. So that's raised the question, why has it been released now? We want to return to this point around timing later in the podcast and also about the implications for the next novel. But firstly, let's just focus on Monday in its own right.
Let's kick off with our general impressions and some context about how we came to the graphic novel. Let's turn to Jan first, and this is a 3-part question. So in order, what has been your experience of graphic novels generally? Have you read any other ones from the River of London series? And what did you make specifically of Monday?
So I haven't had a great experience of graphic novels until I read Alison Bechdel's Fun Home. And that's an autobiography. And I loved it. I thought it was a brilliant graphic novel in the sense that you go over and over the same events of her life, but each time something new is revealed. I loved Fun Home. In fact, I've another one of hers that I got for Christmas, The Secret to superhuman strength, which is also another great one by her. That made me slightly more enthusiastic about the graphic novel, having read those two, whereas before it wouldn't have been something I'd have ever have picked up. I did read one other of The Rivers of London. I read Bodywork, which was quite a fun one about cars driving by themselves and how evil was jumping about. And when a car got smashed up, the evil transferred to either the windscreen that got replaced in another car or in another car. So it was all a bit silly, but quite fun. So I quite enjoyed that. And Monday, I just assumed that Monday was going to be similar, just a bit of a romp, almost as an extra to the novels. But I thought it was quite clever. I liked the fact that it was 4 different points of view about one particular day. I have different feelings about the quality of each chapter. I thought one was definitely way stronger than the other, and I thought one was weaker than the others, which we might want to talk about later. But I had a slight problem when we got the blurb about the next book, finding out that we've got information about the twins having arrived, and then in the next book we have to go back and try and unimagine that they've been born. That looks as if it was a bit, I don't know, unintended for whatever reason. That doesn't quite make sense to me. So I think perhaps there's something gone awry there. But I thought it was interesting and a different way of enjoying the characters than from the novels. I thought the fact that it was almost like a spotlight on a particular day, a particular moment, and a particular aspect of the character. So it wasn't in depth in the same way, but I thought the design of a graphic novel means that you can move around, as in particular with the Nightingale one, without having to say much, because obviously you've got the visual clues there, you've got the picture. Because Ben Aronovich, when he's writing in his novels, has quite a wry take on the characters. He's always making comments about the Met, for instance. I thought that this actually lent itself quite well to his style of writing, because he could have these throwaway lines that seemed to fit the genre.
We can talk about this later. Is the question to which he did write it? Because from my understanding, Andrew Cartmel is the co-writer, and as I understand it, it's mostly Ben coming up with the concept and then Andrew Cartmel actually writing the comic. That can vary. With Margaret and I saw them, both of them at a library before the pandemic, and I think it does vary. Sometimes it's Andrew Cartmel coming up with the idea and Ben Aronovich writing it up. But it's definitely a collaboration. Cartmel gets a writer credit.
Because they're writing about the characters that Ben Aronovich has created. Andrew Cartmel presumably knows the Rivers books well.
I was going to say that he's actually edited some of them, so he knows them exceptionally well.
Yeah.
So he's edited at least a couple of them, hasn't he, Richard?
I think he usually gets a credit. Margaret, what did you make of it?
Well, I love cartoons. I have read Fun Home because I'm in the same book group as Jan, and I love that. I also love the book called Persepholis by Marjan Strafafi. I can't pronounce that right. About growing up in Iran in the 60s and 70s. Linked to our last book, there is a really great graphic novel. It's a novel and then imagination of what might have happened to Ada Lovelace had she managed to live, because she died quite young. But it's called The Thrilling Adventures of Lovelace and Babbage by Sidney Padgett, which I can really recommend. I am not so much into adult comics, but I have read a number of the Rivers of London. I've read Bodywork like Jan, which was a really good intro and one to start with. I read Cry Fox with Abigail. Night Witch is good. Black Mould I've just read, which also features Peter's father in it. And I've also read one that's very, very early one about Nightingale called Action from a Distance, which I like the story, but I've got issues to do with the artwork and consistency and how the characters are drawn in some of them. So they do add little sprinkles of information along the way that are referenced in the main books that are helpful. But I particularly like this one more than all the other ones, just because of the structure of how it was written and the characters that featured in it.
Jennie, you said tentatively.
I think this may be the first graphic novel I've ever read. I do have another Rivers of London one, but I don't know where it is and I haven't read it. And I thought that my main problem would be that I wouldn't like how they were graphically represented, how the characters are represented. Well, I didn't actually have a problem with that. I didn't particularly like the image of Nightingale, but that's only because I've seen others that I think are better. I thought Miriam was fantastic and completely exploited what you have to do in a graphic novel, which is make somebody look so different from anybody else that you don't mistake them. And I actually found quite a few occasions here where I didn't actually know who I was looking at. And it was kind of around young cops and young thieves. I have two main problems. One, Margaret's already mentioned, which is what you do with stuff that probably belongs better in a book than here. A graphic novel it's the only way you can really illustrate Nightingale babysitting the twins. Is to show a picture, and I thought they were very charming pictures. But I do worry about how graphic novels are used to cover stories that actually would probably belong better in a book, where you have more time to explore in more depth the background to a story, how other people feel about it. It's just easier to do that in words, in my view, than in pictures. The other main issue I had was that the first chapter, well, it took me 2 readings, but I got it because there's lots of information in the first chapter. Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of the yellow blocks and the white blocks of dialogue. That almost disappeared after the first chapter. And in the 4th chapter in particular, I have absolutely no idea what that was about because there's no help at all. You know, I read the Nightingale chapter, I read twice, I think, before I got it. I just couldn't be asked to read chapter 4 when there was absolutely nothing to help me at all. So I got very frustrated by that. I'm glad you summarised the plot because I wasn't sure I understood the plot of the entire thing, having made several attempts.
How much of that do you think that is not having read graphic novels before? There's a really good book called Understanding Comics about the whole way in which you learn the shorthand of how comics are constructed. And certainly I agree that the 4th one deliberately, that was a stylistic choice, deliberately jettisoned the captions and hoped that you would be so au fait with the comics medium you would understand, but clearly lost anyone who wasn't au fait with the comics medium.
Yeah, or actually wasn't interested enough in it to become au fait.
Yes. Yeah.
It's an insider thing, I think, to do with the Rivers of London series. I don't think Foxglove speaks. So it's from Foxglove's perspective.
That's not a criticism of graphic novels. I just don't think it's a medium for me.
No.
I think I'm a words person rather than a pictures person, and that's not a criticism. Yeah. The things that jumped out at me as being something that I was initially quite angry about were Pete's father's heart attack, the names of the twins, and little pieces of the Nightingale history that I was, if I hadn't read a graphic novel, which I wouldn't have done if we weren't doing this podcast, then I would have lost those pieces of the story.
But were they essential? I mean, they weren't
essential for here. They weren't essential for here, which is why they were a bit of a surprise.
But were they essential for the books? I mean, it's a nice little bit when he's wandering around with a storm cloud over his head. And we get to understand more about his relationship with the friend he lost after Mellanby, who he lost after the war. To me, I thought that the 4 chapters were, you know, the werewolf story is utterly inconsequential and deliberately so. It's a MacGuffin to hang the 4 chapters on. The 4 chapters are really character pieces. It's about understanding more about Stephanopoulos, getting an insight into young Nightingale's school days. We get to see a bit of Peter and the babies, and then we also get a bit more on Foxglove and actually what she looks like, because I don't think she's been in the graphic novels up to now.
I don't think they're essential, but for somebody who is been interested more than anybody in Nightingale and his background, to miss even something like his relationship with Mellanby and what might have happened to Mellanby and the werewolf in Prague, that I missed that.
Well, if you want to see Nightingale bring down a German fighter jet by the power of magic alone, then you need to read Action at a
Distance.
It does raise a question about how you decide to use them. I can understand why somebody wants to introduce them, but there should be, I think, more consideration of how they're used and what they do to the overall impact of the brand, the Rivers of London brand. I think that's something that maybe gets slightly overridden in the excitement.
I mean, for me, as the podcast resident nerd, it's probably not a surprise to hear I read tons of graphic novels. I would still concur with Jennie, strangely, that despite my love of graphic novels, if you force me at gunpoint, I'd still rather read a book.
Yes, definitely.
But I see them as effectively a different art form. They're not books with pictures. I think particularly what I like about the Rivers of London ones is that it is a chance to see things not from Peter's perspective and to have stories that you can't have in the main ones. For example, Cry Fox, basically the core characters are Abigail and Gilead throughout, and Peter and Nightingale are hardly in it. So it widens out and deepens our understanding of the characters. I am separately a big fan of Andrew Cartmel and his own series called The Vinyl Detective, which is, I think, 5 books in with the 6th book about to come out, is hugely recommended. As you may be aware, obligatory Doctor Who reference, Andrew Cartmel was the showrunner on Doctor Who and gave Ben Aranovich his big break. Although it is Andrew Cartmel probably writing most of the book of the actual core of the comic books. They are virtually, a hive mind when it comes to this sort of thing.
The only problem I had with Monday was the twins arriving.
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Is that deliberate or not? Initially, I thought, that's some sort of timey-wimey, clever thing he's doing, and we'll find out why. But when the blurb came out for the next book, and it's quite clear that they are yet to be born and probably will be born in the next book, I'm leaning more towards the fact that Titan are an entirely independent, separate company who do the comic books. And I wonder if they just got out of sync, because the Rivers novels have been coming out fairly regularly, but there's been a bit of a gap due to the pandemic.
It's just quite a huge enterprise to manage, so I can quite see that it's easy to...
Yeah, and my gut feeling, and I'd love to know, but my gut feeling would be that they probably did realise they were getting out of sync, but then thought, sod it. Does anyone believe that Peter and Beverly are not going to successfully have the twins? I mean, it's not that sort of a book series, is it? No. And then with regard to the names, Margaret's been doing a bit of desk research.
The only person that refers to them by name is Nightingale, and their names actually come from West African folklore. And it says in the book that Teo is the one that comes first and Kahende is the one that proceeds after. They say in the folklore that the second one actually is born earlier because she pushes the first one out.
Oh.
So I don't know whether Nightingale is just referring to them in the sense of identifying which one of the 2 babies was born first, because that's the sort of... So if you look up, because I was looking up, and apologies if I pronounced their names wrongly, I was looking up how to pronounce them. Yeah.
The theory is that we don't know their names. It's just Nightingale showing his local knowledge in the same way that, I don't know, an Italian might refer to twins as Romulus and Remus.
Yeah.
So we might not know their names.
Wait for the next book to find out.
I think we've hinted about this a little bit, but it'd be interesting to know what was your favourite chapter.
Well, mine was definitely the first one, because I hadn't seen anything of Miriam, and I think she's a great caricature. It was great to hear somebody else running an operation within the Met, and how Peter gets involved, how he's brought in to things like that. So I enjoyed that, but it was also the one I understood the best.
Jan?
Oh, absolutely. Chapter 1 was way superior, I thought, to the others. Partly because there was just a completeness to it. Even the fact that it started first thing in the morning and finished last thing at night. So it was clearly a day. And I loved the characterization of Miriam Stephanopoulos. And that's who I'm going to see forevermore, the image of her. And I thought it was a really strong image, sort of powerful, those piercing eyes. and the sort of the fun side of her in the morning and at the end of the day, and then serious, getting on with a proper job. The police procedure was in evidence throughout that chapter. I think it was very clear what was going on. And all the little things, the little thought bubbles I thought were great, so that she was carrying on the normal job, but in her head, thinking, I've got this bunch of idiots to deal with here. And her ability to really sum up the characters. That was one thing I thought that was a real strength of the graphic novel. I liked the bit where she was trying to work out, oh, well, that one, she looks okay. Peter vouches for her, but he's been wrong before. And the one, well, his shoes look too good. So it was a very quick, you didn't have to go into great detail. So I liked the way that was carried out. And also her view of Peter, which I think, because we've read all the novels so far, we would agree with that, he used to be a bit impulsive and, didn't concentrate, and look how far he's come. So there was the respect there. But yeah, that was definitely, I thought, by far my favourite chapter. And my least favourite was the Nightingale one, I have to say.
Well, that was my favourite one.
Really?
Yeah. I just really like the structure of it. The flashbacks to him at school, the moral clash with his teacher or headmaster. Obviously, it's in the shadow of the upcoming conflict and whether Nightingale would want to fight or not. I did like the little thing about him having his own little storm cloud following him around.
I don't think we get inside his head at all. This is not being told from the Nightingale perspective. And as you were talking about Miriam and all the kind of thoughts she had, we really do get inside her head. But we're not inside Nightingale's head at all.
Other than it's him remembering it.
No.
Because
we don't hear what he thinks about it.
No, you're right, he's the one flashing back, but we don't get thought bubbles or the narratives that come out. You're right.
I thought it was a bit clunky, that one, I have to say. It didn't roll as easily as the others to me. And I agree with something Jennie said early on. I couldn't get Nightingale. He wasn't distinctive enough to me, apart from the time when you saw him with the cane. The others, Peter, Stephanopoulos, I've got a real strong image of them, but the image that I started with of Nightingale, I still have, whereas it didn't add anything to it from reading.
When I read that Nightingale chapter at least 3 times, he's drawn too young, way too young. And compared to the other graphic novels, and some of the images you might be from some of those graphic novels or fronts of graphic novels that are used in pictures. He could be anything from about 30 upwards. He hasn't got any creases on his face. The bit at the beginning, I thought, oh, maybe this is Nightingale. It's sort of like 20, 30 years ago, having a shave, until I worked out he was at the Folly.
Yeah.
So I had an issue with, not with the chapter, but I had an issue with how Nightingale was drawn, basically.
Yeah. My image of him is actually the image we use on the
podcast.
That's about the age I tend to think of him. Yeah.
His face is slightly more chiselled and worn and experienced, whereas this was like...
He doesn't look... Sorry, I was just going to say, he doesn't look much different from when he's in school, does he?
No. Or when he's in the Second World War either. I really like the first chapter, so I'm not going to talk about that again because it sort of set it up. But I really like the back end of Peter's, where he sort of does that reflection towards the end. And there's a little bit of Leslie in there and shooting of the faceless man. But the bit from where he sort of steps out of the case and it goes into his personal life, and he's going back to the hospital, but this time because his father's there, and his sort of reflections at the end, all the things that have not been so great. I found just that last bit of that chapter really, really interesting. But again, to your point, should that really have been in the graphic novel?
It's interesting that there is this assumption, therefore, that a graphic novel is an inferior art form.
Yeah.
When you say, well, should it be in the graphic novel? It's like, should it be?
No, but I liked it.
Away on an inferior thing, whereas to me they're running in parallel. That the graphic novel is there to do things that you can't do in a book. I'll throw it out there, but this book, I don't think this graphic novel could work as a book. because the approach of seeing the same day from 4 different people's perspectives, yes, you can do that in 4 chapters in a book, but you wouldn't then be able to go back and notice other characters running through the back of bits. Yeah, you actually, when in the final chapter, you find out how Abigail and Foxglove sneak back into the Folly, and you see that when you flick back, you can actually see that going on in the background of chapter 2, and you can also see them chasing the werewolf in the background of chapter 1, when in the foreground we see the detectives chasing the pickpocket. I read it over Christmas when I was staying with my mum, and she read it afterwards and then went back and flipped through it about 5 times, I think.
I think I'm going to have to flip back many times.
And not in a bad way, but she was just fascinated.
I did the same, and not as probably as many times, but I definitely read it through at least 3 times to just check when things had happened.
To be honest, though, I don't think there's much you can't say with words. So the idea that if you want to paint a picture, it has to go in a graphic novel, I don't think it's true.
No, but I
just have to plan it a bit better.
I think there's a brevity about this, though, isn't there? You know, a shorthand. I think I agree with Richard. This is a completely different genre, isn't it? Yes. So it has a different purpose. So it's not going to give you the depth that, or, you know, obviously just the lack of language is not going to be the same as a novel. I mean, I would always choose a novel over a graphic novel. But in recent times, I've been surprised how much I've enjoyed and seen what you can do with a graphic novel if it's done well, I suppose.
Picking up on Stephanopoulos, you would never get that amount of space. You'd never get that amount of information about her or her perceptions just because she is not a minor character, but she's a secondary character in the Rivers of London. So that's what some of the graphic novels have been really good at, is giving smaller characters more form and more space that they would never get in Rivers of London generally.
But then if you want them more prominent, give them more prominence in the books.
Or give them a novella.
Yeah.
Okay, how did we feel about the artwork and the characterization? Did you appreciate the artwork? And did all the people look like you imagined them to be, say?
I appreciated quite a lot of it, but it's hard to do because if you've got a lot of characters, trying to make them different from each other is very difficult. But I thought Miriam was brilliant. Like we said, we're not sure about Nightingale. And there were too many of the young, very small characters who looked exactly the same. But then you do it with their clothes, which sometimes also wasn't very well delineated. You just got to find something that tells you who this person is. And if you don't know that Foxglove is going to appear, then you have I had no idea who that person was running around the Folly with no clothes on.
It is tricky, isn't it? This series started in 2015, so it started 3-4 years after the books started coming out. And the artists arguably are on a hiding for nothing for 2 reasons. One, because long-term readers have already formed in their head, this is what they look like, and they're never going to match. It's like, it's almost like trying to play Snap, trying to say, is this how you thought Leslie looked? No, oh dear. You never, that's a common, on the internet reviews, common thread is that isn't how I thought X looked, which is really tricky. Then you've got the second challenge, which is consistency, because although the first 5 or 6 were drawn by the same artist, they have mixed and matched the artist since then. And of course, you're then trying to get an artist to copy another artist's characterization is tricky, and you then start to realize why nearly all the long running comic series are superheroes, because they've got costumes.
Yeah, exactly.
So you've got enough to be able to switch the artist from year to year without anyone saying that's not Spider-Man, that's not. Might argue about.
But then as soon as this gets televised, all bets are off, because the televised characters will not look like the written characters.
So it is tricky. It is tricky. I mean, I personally, I'm reaching the conclusion that it won't be televised. I don't think there's going to be a TV series. And ironically, I think there's more chance of the novels being put into graphic novels at some point.
Oh, really?
Because I just think the cost of filming in London is going to be so. What Rivers of London?
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be shot in London. So much stuff that's set in.
They shot it in Manchester, and that was based in London, didn't they?
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess if for authenticity, you're going to know straight away it isn't London, isn't it?
Yeah, but there are parts that have to be authentic, and the folly doesn't have to be authentic because nobody knows what the folly looks like.
Yeah, true.
There's just a few establishing shots that you can shoot in London.
So, and in terms of characters, I don't know if Jan's read up in linking to the bodywork. But I think Beverly's drawn much better here. In bodywork, she's drawn like your classic, huge, it's in at the waist, big at the top, very skinny.
Yeah.
Like like how they tend to draw girls in Superman magazines and stuff like that. Whereas this, she's drawn much more in a normal way, as is his mother. Well, I just think most of it, Nightingale's the one I have an issue with. The rest I haven't.
Are you likely to read more Rivers of London graphic novels?
I may. I do have one somewhere in this house that I haven't read yet. So if I can find it, I might read it.
I think you've got Cry Fox.
I've got Cry Fox, yeah. But I wouldn't.
You're not desperate.
No, I wouldn't pre-order. So I have already pre-ordered Amongst Our Weapons, but I wouldn't pre-order a graphic novel.
Me too. I have too.
Jan, would you read more?
Well, I think I'm more inclined to read more than before I read these two. So that's probably a good sign that I appreciated them, because I wasn't particularly looking forward to it. But I feel that, I do feel it sort of enriched my reading of the other books, just getting these little snapshots. It's just been quite just a fun little aside, really. But I'm very much looking forward to Amongst Our Weapons.
I'm going to ask Richard a question.
Yeah.
Having read pretty much all the graphic novels, is this your favourite one?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, definitely, yeah, I think so. I think it's the one that uses the medium to its best. It's my favourite art so far. I love the work that Lee Sullivan did on the first 6 books or so, but I like his work anyway. I've read a number of other graphic novels that he's done the artwork for, but the new artist who's come on board for this one and is apparently staying on board for the next one. So yeah, I thought the artwork was really, really good. So and as a very poor cartoonist myself, I really, really enjoyed the artwork. Okay, so let's move on in the final section of our hopefully not too epic podcast to the next novel, which is to be published. In our last pod about False Value, we had a very short discussion at the end about what we're expecting and hoping for. We now have a name, Amongst Our Weapons, and we have a back cover blurb, which I won't read out here, but basically reveals that the focus of the novel seemingly is on the London silver vaults and a mysterious crime that the Special Assessment Unit are brought in to investigate. Does confirm that the twins have yet to be born, and ends with the revelation that Peter doesn't know that he's about to encounter something and somebody that nobody ever expects.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Our chief weapon is surprise. Surprise and fear. Fear and surprise are 2 weapons. Our fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency are 3 weapons. Our fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency and an almost fanatical devotion to the Pope are 4. No. Amongst our weapons. Amongst our weaponry are such elements as fear. I'll come in again.
that may alarm people who felt there were too many Hitchhikers references in the last book. Is this going to be?
We're now going to a Monty Python. I love the Silver Vault, so I'm very, very excited to go back down into the Silver Vaults.
Tell me more. I know nothing about them.
You know, so it's like an underground market with lots of different stalls, and some of them are better looking than others, and they have proper glass and the proper shops, and others are like market stalls. But it's under another building. I can't remember the name of the building that we had to go through to get into it.
So, I mean, here's the thought. Does Monday, which has been the main focus of what we've been discussing, make you more excited about the next novel, or does it actually slightly undermine the novel? You mentioned being slightly angry at one point, Jennie, because I'd say that if we assume that, I think the jury's decided that Monday is set after the next book, then that means that all the characters featured in Monday get through the next book completely unharmed and unchanged. Arguably,
I don't think we can assume that. If we assume it was done in error, then anything could happen, and also everybody can change their mind.
Because the continuity. I mean, they are canon, the graphic novels. So clearly, after the birth of the two twins whose names we may or may not know, Peter, Beverly, Nightingale, et al. Are all alive and perfectly fine.
Yeah, but I wouldn't put it past Ben Aronovich to decide that he'd rather upset the graphic novelist readers than the other novel, and you know, people do that all the time. So I don't think you can assume that, but it's more likely than not that they do all survive it.
I'd be asking for my money back then. I'm not buying a graphic novel if it's not canon. We're going to get into branching universes. I mean, this is where the Marvel universe.
No, we're not, Richard. We're going to get into timey-wimey, aren't we?
Well, it's more possible it's timey-wimey.
We have a question from a new listener, John, who says, I'd be interested in hearing your opinions on how the potential new big bad pointed out at the end of False Value will be integrated into the series. Was it a one-off reference never to be seen again, or is it going to be a major part of future plots, or only shows up in the finales but is otherwise unmentioned? What do we think?
I don't think this is referring to the computer magnet. This was this impression Peter had that there was something evil lurking out in a void, dark place behind everything. Is this what the end of the blurb is referring to? Something out there that...
Well, I kind of always assumed that there's got to be a supervillain. And, you know, if they thought that Martin Chorley was the supervillain, then there's got to be another one somewhere, even worse, lurking. And that other someone might be Leslie. Yes. Who knows? So yes, I think there is another supervillain.
Have you seen the cover reveal for the book?
Yes.
The video?
Yes.
Because at the end of that, it goes to static, and then we see a face sort of vaguely shimmering in the background. That could be a mask.
It could. I did notice that.
I assumed it was like a ghost or a like an alien or something, but it could be a mask.
Yeah.
But then hasn't Leslie got her face back?
But wasn't that dependent on Chorley, wasn't it?
So you don't think it's got anything to do with this sort of deep thought, the AI program that...
Or some sort of alternate magic world that we just don't know about.
Yeah.
Just mean some sort of...
Yeah. Margaret and I have been watching Stranger Things. Is it the upside down?
I have to say that as soon as I saw that reveal, I thought, oh, it's got to be Leslie.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that if False Value was a new season opener, I'm hoping this is the one where it hits the ground and we start to get some very clear plot threads developing. It would be nice. I don't necessarily want Leslie to turn up, but it would be nice to at least have it acknowledged that she's out there, whether she can now move on to WhatsApp Peter rather than texting him, because that's getting better.
Yeah.
I'm sure. I can't believe she won't turn up.
I can't believe she's disappeared for good.
She's too good a character for him to write her out completely.
So that's what we thought of Monday. We'll be back in late April or early May 2022, assuming Amongst Our Weapons is released on time.
Meanwhile, if you've enjoyed the podcast, please send us feedback by email at follypodcast@gmail.com or leave a comment on our website, thefollycast.com. The Follycast theme you've been hearing is London is Inspired by Cutwater, and links to their site are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.